Welcome back to the show, everyone. My name is Darren Brown. This is the California Dream, broadcasting from occupied California. Today on the show, it's going to be a little bit different. So normally I take just a handful of topics and kind of go in depth into them. The theme for today, though, is going to be that the mainstream media is finally saying what we've been saying in the California independence movement for years. And when I say we, I mean more than just me. I mean a lot of different people who have been involved in this much longer than I have. As I've mentioned previously, I just started thinking about and talking about these issues about a year and a half ago. But there are many people in this movement who have been at this for 5, 10 years or more. And so I'm really referring to a lot of what they've been saying and what they've been talking about for a long time. And a lot of times in the past, when they would say these things, when we would say these things, we were often dismissed. That's crazy talk. You don't know what you're talking about. You're being alarmist. You're being overly dramatic. And what we've seen in the past 2 to 3 months, and really even the past few weeks, quite recently, is a lot of these topics have now entered the mainstream media. And when I say the mainstream media, I mean the mainstream. So I'm not just talking about some little podcast somewhere or some independent media or some alternative media. I'm talking about the major news networks, the major magazines, major newspapers in the United States and the world. And they're coming around to talking about a lot of these things. So the point I want to make is that we have really been ahead of the curve on things. And again, when I say we, I mean a lot of different people. We've been ahead of the curve on what's going to be happening in the United States and the United States' relationship to California, and also ahead of the curve in having explanations for why these things are happening. So not just observing what's happening, but having a coherent explanation for what's going on around us. And I'm going to present a number of different sources here. There's more than 2 dozen. I think there's between 25 and 30. And these are very recent. And I'm not going to spend much time on any one particular item. But altogether, I think they paint a certain picture. And yes, it is possible to isolate one of these particular commentators or one of these particular articles or essays or media coverage and say, well, I don't quite agree with what they're saying there. I think they're wrong because of this and this. But there are so many different sources. There's so many different people raising the same questions, raising the same topics, that it's kind of hard to ignore it in its entirety. You can dismiss one person here or a couple people over here, but when there's person after person after person from different segments of the media, from different organizations with different perspectives, and they're all saying similar things, it's really hard to ignore that. It's really hard to look at that and say, they're all on the wrong track. They're all overreacting. They're all being alarmist and dramatic. We have to take it seriously. And I'm also aware that some of this media coverage may be due to the fact that we just passed the 1-year anniversary of January 6th. And I think that does have something to do with the timing, maybe of some of these reports and the timing of some of this commentary. But I think this is more than that. I think these are long-standing issues, and this coverage would have come out at some point along the way, regardless of any particular date or any particular anniversary. So what I'm going to do is just going to jump right in here. There are 4 major themes that I'm going to hit upon. And for each of these, there's several different sources I'm going to cite, and I'm just going to run through them quickly. I'll give you the title, the author, a quick summary of what they had to say, maybe a couple quick quotes, and then I'm just going to move to the next one. It's going to go very quick because, as I said, I have about 25 to 30 different sources here. So the four different themes are: first, the Constitution isn't working and America is fundamentally broken from a structural point of view. The second theme is fascism in America. The third is secession, independence, dissolution of the United States. And the fourth is civil war and or political instability in the U.S. So let's start with the first one. The Constitution isn't working, America is broken. This has been a running theme in the California independence movement for a long time. People have talked about this a lot, that the kind of problems that we're having is not just, between Democrats and Republicans. It's not particular things that happen at particular times over particular issues. That a lot of the conflict that we're having and the reason that the federal government is unable to get anything done is really baked into the system. It's baked into the Constitution itself, that the Constitution itself is fundamentally a conservative document, not in the sense of being politically conservative, but conservative in the sense that it doesn't lend itself to getting things done. There's so many checks and balances in it that it prevents legislation from occurring. It prevents things from getting done. And of course, there are a number of compromises that were made at the time of the Constitution, mainly to paper over or reconcile the differences between the slave states and the free states and the institution of slavery. These would be things like the Electoral College, the Senate, and even non-constitutional arrangements like the filibuster, which, although it's not part of the Constitution, is kind of part of the institutional norms of the Senate. So all of these things are indicative of the fact that the Constitution may have been something that was appropriate at the time, but it's really outdated, and it's really an archaic document that just is not up to meeting the challenges that we have here in the 21st century. So the first article I want to talk about is entitled, "The Constitution Isn't Working." This is an opinion piece in The Hill, and it was written December 28th, 2021, so just a few weeks ago. And I'll just read you a couple quotes from it. It starts off, quote, "The U.S. Constitution is the sacred text of the American government and civic life, but it's time to face the facts. The document written in 1787 isn't working. The signs are all around us." The author continues later on, "It won't be enough merely to reform the filibuster, add more justices to the Supreme Court, change presidents, or surrender presidential powers to Congress. A document written in 1787 is inadequate for the 21st century. The Electoral College is poised to create more misfires, with popular vote winners not becoming president, as has happened twice already this century. Territorial expansion has resulted in 16% of the U.S. population controlling half the seats in the U.S. Senate." Unquote. So this is, again, things that we've been saying for a long time, that the constitutional structure is allowing a minority of the country to dictate legislation and also to win elections that they lose. And we've already had this happen twice in the century, and it's likely to happen again. So when you hear Democrats saying things like, we just need to abolish the filibuster, we just need to expand the court, we just need to have all these reforms, there is this author, a professor of politics, saying, no, it goes deeper than that. The problems are in the structure of the Constitution itself. But this is not the only commentator saying similar things. There are two recent articles in Politico. Another opinion piece. "Republicans are moving rapidly to cement minority rule. Blame the Constitution." Okay, so not saying blame Republicans, blame Democrats, blame the media, blame the Constitution. The subtitle, "Democracy is in Trouble, but a Lawless Coup Isn't the Real Threat." This is by Corey Robbins, published January 5th, 2022. Another professor of political science. And this is really a key quote that he has in the article. Quote, "We have one party, in other words, currently out of power in the national government, trying to legislate a future in which it can lose elections, but legally acquire or hold on to power. We have a second party, currently in power, doing little to stop the first." Equal representation of the citizenry hasn't become the enemy of the contemporary Republican Party. It has been the enemy for more than a half century. Ronald Reagan opposed the 1965 Voting Rights Act from the beginning, explaining later that he believed it was, quote, humiliating to the South. When the act came up for its third renewal in 1982, Reagan's lawyers in the Justice Department, led by a 20-something John Roberts, mightily resisted it and much needed amendments to it. When it came up for renewal again in 2006, the act nearly broke the House Republican caucus in two. And then he goes on further down to really attack the Constitution itself. Quote, democracy is not just the enemy of the Republican Party, it is also the enemy of the Constitution. Americans associate the Constitution with popular liberties such as due process and freedom of speech. They overlook its architecture of state power, which erects formidable barriers to equal representation and majority rule in all three branches of government. So what he's really saying here is that the Constitution is a fundamentally anti-democratic document, and one of the two major parties in the United States, the Republican Party, finds itself in the minority, and it is leveraging all of these anti-democratic structural impediments that are embedded into the Constitution to cement minority rule in the United States. That's what he's saying. And then there's another opinion piece from Politico. This is from Sarah Isgur. Hope I'm pronouncing her name right. And she was actually in the Justice Department of the Trump administration. So this is not a liberal. This is not a leftist. And she has a piece called "It's Time to Amend the Constitution." This is really a bizarre piece, I think. If you read it, her conclusion is that the Constitution is outdated and needs to be changed, but then she frets about how difficult the amendment process is, that it's so incredibly difficult to make any changes to the Constitution that she says that we should pass an amendment that changes the amending process itself. So she thinks we should have an amendment to the Constitution that would lower the threshold for amendments from 3/4 to 2/3. This is really a bizarre, I mean, these are the kind of mental pretzels that people get themselves in to try and figure out a way to fix this problem. I mean, this is just utterly bizarre kind of thinking. Finally, a few months ago in the Washington Post, Robert Kagan had a very lengthy essay. Now, I'm not a big fan of Robert Kagan for many different reasons, but it's an excellent article. It's called "Our Constitutional Crisis is Already Here." And what he's talking about specifically is the fact that the structure of the Constitution is not able to deal with these kind of contested elections. So we have federal elections, but they're decentralized. All the states do their own thing. And then we have these really antiquated institutions like the Electoral College and the Electoral Count Act from 100 and something years ago. And the point he's making is that Republicans have the opportunity to leverage and take advantage of these antiquated institutions and antiquated laws to, in effect, steal an election. So not only is the Constitution unable to provide a government that gets anything done, the Constitution is not even able to stop a party from stealing an election. So when you take all of these together, this is finally a conversation that's happening in the mainstream media, The Hill, Politico, The Washington Post, and I could find a few others on this topic. But we've been saying for a long time, the Constitution is flawed. The Constitution itself is causing these conflicts. And now we're seeing that discussion being brought into the mainstream. Something that was once kind of a fringe idea is now in the mainstream media. Okay, let's move on to fascism. This is something that I've talked about for a while, and I know that a lot of people in the independence movement have talked about for a while. We talk about the growing fascist movement in the United States. Well, we have been using that terminology and that kind of language for quite a while. And finally, this is now a topic of discussion in major mainstream media. So there was an article in The Guardian. The Guardian is one of the oldest and most respected publications in the world. and they had a very lengthy essay by Jason Stanley. This was published on December 22nd, 2021. So, again, just a few weeks ago, and it's entitled, "America is Now in Fascism's Legal Phase." And here's just a few quick quotes. "We are now in fascism's legal phase. According to the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law, 45 states have considered 230 bills criminalizing protest, with the threat of violent leftist and black rebellion being used to justify them. That this is happening at the same time that multiple electoral bills enabling a Republican state legislature majority to overturn their state's elections has been enacted suggests that the true aim of bills criminalizing protest is to have a response in place to the expected protest against the stealing of a future election. As a reminder of fascism's historical connection to big business, some of these laws criminalize protests near gas and oil lines. The Nazis used Judeo-Bolshevism as their constructed enemy. The fascist movement in the Republican Party has turned to critical race theory instead. Fascism feeds off a narrative of supposed national humiliation by internal enemies, defending a fictional, glorious, and virtuous national past, and presenting its enemies as deviously maligning the nation to its children is a classic fascist strategy to sow fury and resentment. Using the bogeyman of critical race theory, 29 states have introduced bills to restrict teaching about racism and sexism in schools, and 13 states have enacted such bans." Unquote. So this is written by a leading scholar on fascism. So Jason Stanley actually has a book entitled How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them. And he states right here that there is, quote, "a fascist movement in the Republican Party." And this is in The Guardian. This is like one of the most prominent publications on the planet. He ends with the following, quote, "Donald Trump has shown others what is possible, but the fascist movement he now leads preceded him and will outlive him." Unquote. So he's saying, look, Donald Trump is not the primary problem. You could get rid of Donald Trump, and we're still going to have this fascist problem in America. This is a movement that began before Donald Trump, and it will remain after Donald Trump. This is something that has deep roots in American history. Continuing on, Chauncey DeVega is a columnist for Salon, which is a progressive website, and he has an article. This was December 2nd, 2021, titled, "If America Really Surrenders to Fascism, Then What? Painful Questions Lie Ahead. If the worst happens in 2024, will you stay or go? It's not too early to have a plan B for life under fascism." So here's a key quote from this article. "Our failing democracy is close to being fatally undermined by a rigged electoral system designed to ensure that it will be almost impossible for Republicans to lose an election. Public opinion polls and other research has shown that those Americans who are deeply concerned for democracy and want to see Trump and his cabal punished for their obvious crimes are increasingly exhausted. Many have stopped believing that true justice will ever be done. By comparison, most Republican voters have internalized the big lie that the 2020 election was stolen and are inclined to believe that Donald Trump is still a legitimate president. A large percentage of Republicans also believe that their traditional way of life is under threat and are willing to endorse or condone violence to defend it. And traditional and defend are given in scare quotes there. In the end, a plurality of Americans, if not a majority, through tacit consent or just plain indifference, are surrendering to the neo-fascist tide and allowing themselves to be submerged in it. Trump's followers and other conservatives are energized by their belief that the rising fascist tide will carry them back to their imagined greatness as the real Americans. They will be drowned too. That will just take longer." Unquote. So here we have a columnist in a major progressive website saying, hey, we need to think, what are our options? What are we going to do when fascism comes to America? So there's another article that Chauncey DeVega has. "Timothy Snyder warned us fascism was coming. Now he says we can survive it." I'm not sure about that. Quote, in a series of conversations at Salon, Snyder has repeatedly warned and predicted how Donald Trump's regime, the Republican Party, and their ascendant neo-fascist movement would threaten the foundations and future of American democracy. In May of 2017, he speculated on how quickly American democracy could begin to crumble in the face of this assault. In this new conversation, Snyder reflects on how and why America's democracy crisis is getting worse, the seductive power of normalization and denial, and how Trump and the Republican fascist movement have tried to capture and debase the concept of freedom. Unquote. So this is a commentator in a major progressive publication saying the Republican Party has a strong fascist movement within it, and a lot of Americans are in a state of normalization and denial. They don't want to face up to what's happening. They want to pretend it's not there. This is something we've been saying for a long time. When we talk about normalcy bias, the cognitive bias that leads you not to assess what's happening objectively around you. So we've been saying this for a long time, and now major commentators are saying this. Okay, so maybe you think Salon is, not the most mainstream publication. How about MSNBC? So a couple months ago, this was October 31st, 2021, Mehdi Hasan, who regularly talks in this kind of language, had a piece entitled, "If you're not scared about American fascism, you're not paying attention." Whether it's restricting voting, restricting reading lists in schools, or restricting what public employees are allowed to say and do when they're off the clock. Mehdi Hasan argues that the bigger picture we cannot lose sight of, the dark bow that ties it all together, is that Republicans are doing everything in their power to turn the U.S. into the world's next authoritarian regime. So, this is MSNBC. This is one of the most mainstream establishment, corporate media outlets in the United States. And they have a commentator on here saying, hey, America is heading towards fascism. This is not ZMAG. This is not Truthdig. This is not the Young Turks. This is not the World Socialist website. This is MSNBC. Okay, MSNBC saying this. But wait, there's more. December 31st, 2021, in The New Republic. We surveyed experts on democracy. They're worried about the U.S. turning even more authoritarian. And they have a question. On a scale of 1 to 10, how concerned are you that the U.S. will become more authoritarian over the next 5 years? And then they have a series of responses from different commentators. One of them says, I'm somewhere around a 6 or 7 right now. If by the end of January we don't have passage of new voting rights legislation, I'm at a 9. We have someone from a law school. We're at 8. Democracy is losing both its popular and institutional supports. There's Mehdi Hasan, 11 out of 10. One of our 2 major parties has given up on democracy and openly embraced voter suppression, partisan gerrymandering, and election subversion. Then we have another fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I am concerned about harm to liberal democracy at a 9. So, a 9, 8, 11 out of 10, 9. All of these people were concerned about the U.S. turning towards authoritarianism. And it looks like California might finally be waking up to what's going on because the San Francisco Chronicle, one of the major newspapers in the state of California, has an editorial, January 1st, 2022. American fascism is still rising. What are you going to do about it, California? Posed as a question. And here's just a brief quote from the editorial. Again, this is the San Francisco Chronicle, not a major leftist or socialist outlet. Quote, we appear to be headed toward permanent one-party minority rule at the federal level, and the unconscionable refusal of Democrat Senators Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema to react to this open threat, as well as a near total absence of principled Republicans and GOP crackdowns on the precious few who exist, has left Congress's Democratic majority seemingly resigned to ride out the clock until the 2022 midterms sweep them out of power, possibly for good. And then there's California, the most powerful state in the nation and the public face of the progressive movement, clearly has a duty to do something in response to the potential fall of American democracy, unquote. Wow. I'm going to say that again, that last part. Quote, the most powerful state in the nation and the public face of the progressive movement clearly has a duty to do something in response to the potential fall of American democracy, unquote. Wow, that's the kind of language that we've been using for a long time. 5-10 years ago, again, when we were called alarmists, we were called nuts. And here it is in the San Francisco Chronicle saying, hey, Californians, you need to wake up. America is heading towards authoritarianism. It's heading towards fascism. It's heading towards one-party, minority rule. The American Democratic Party is not up to the task. They're just letting the Republicans run rampant over the federal government. We need to do something. We need to have a conversation now. What are we going to do about this? And then we have an opinion piece that was recently published December 31st, 2021 in the Globe and Mail, which is one of the major media outlets in Canada. It's entitled, The American Polity is Cracked and Might Collapse. Canada Must Prepare. The U.S. is becoming increasingly ungovernable, and some experts believe it could descend into civil war. What should Canada do then? So this is by Thomas Homer Dixon. He is the executive director at the Cascade Institute at Royal Roads University. And here's just a few brief quotes from his article. Quote, by 2025, American democracy could collapse, causing extreme domestic political instability, including widespread civil violence. By 2030, if not sooner, the country could be governed by a right-wing dictatorship, unquote. Wow, those are some pretty strong words. Now, that's not me saying that. That's not people in the California independence movement saying that. That's a Canadian saying that. By 2025, American democracy could be gone. And by 2030, the U.S. could be a right-wing dictatorship. He continues, we mustn't dismiss these possibilities just because they seem ludicrous or too horrible to imagine. In 2014, the suggestion that Donald Trump would become president would also have struck nearly everyone as absurd. But today we live in a world where the absurd regularly becomes real and the horrible commonplace. And he goes on in the article to talk about various steps that Canada could take to prepare for this. So this is not really directed at Americans. This is directed at Canadians saying, look, we might have a crisis here. We share a big border with the United States, and it's an unstable country. What are we going to do if, there's civil breakdown? What are we going to do if there's a flood of millions and millions of refugees and asylum seekers coming over the border into Canada? What are we going to do when the nuclear arsenal of the United States is in jeopardy because of the unrest in the U.S.? We need to prepare for all of these situations. He says, quote, beyond a certain threshold, other new research shows political extremism feeds on itself, pushing polarization toward an irreversible tipping point. This suggests a sixth potential parallel with Weimar. Democratic collapse followed by the consolidation of dictatorship, unquote. So again, a warning from a Canadian to his fellow Canadians. We need to be ready for the collapse of the United States. Okay, well, let's move on to our next major theme. There are a number of different articles that have come out quite recently on secession or independence movements or the dissolution or devolution of the United States. And we'll start with a new book that is coming out from Stephen Marsh. He is the author of The Next Civil War, Dispatches from the American Future. And he has an article in the Washington Post. In Washington Post, it doesn't get more mainstream than that, entitled, Secession Might Seem Like the Lesser of Two Evils. It's also the less likely. So he cites Marjorie Taylor Greene's tweet about national divorce, which we'll get to later. He also cites some of the surveys and reports that we've cited previously on this podcast about the desire for secession or the desire for devolution of the United States. He quotes Richard Kreitner, secession as an actual political program, quote, is being normalized in an unwinding and degrading country, unquote. Richard Kreitner is the author of a book, Break It Up, which is about the history of secessionist movements in the United States. Marsh continues, quote, it's not hard to see why the idea is gaining traction. Talk of secession is still mostly just talk, but wouldn't it be a civilized way to deal with the deep divisions in the country? Wouldn't it beat, say, the Civil War that a restive segment of the population hungers for? Unquote. So he cites that California has the 5th largest economy in the world and would rank 36th in population among all countries, with the world's largest technology and entertainment sectors. A separate California would have the largest national median income in the world. Then he goes on to talk about Texas v. White, which is the Supreme Court decision about secession. He also mentions the fact that there's a number of independence movements in the world at the moment. He quotes Brian Griffiths, he's a professor at Syracuse University, focuses on secession and the study of sovereignty. Quote, there's only one sovereignty game, Griffiths points out. Everybody needs to get in the same club, and that club is the United Nations, which would require the approval of whoever is still technically the government of the United States, unquote. So this is what we've been saying with Texas v. White, that it does leave open the possibility because it says that secession is possible with the consent of the states. So this is the Washington Post, major American newspaper publication, talking seriously about secession and independence movements in the U.S. Now, a lot of this talk was brought up by, as we mentioned earlier, Marjorie Taylor Greene's tweet. So Marjorie Taylor Greene had a tweet on December 30th, 2021. Quote, you know what is necessary about threatening a divorce? It's a wake-up call to the one offending the other that they've had enough. And if the other party cares at all, they look at what they are doing wrong and care to fix it. National divorce is not civil war. So this particular tweet, of course, prompted a flurry of consternation from the talking heads. And they really missed the fact that she said, national divorce is not civil war. So she's actually saying this is a better option than civil war. So why is that a bad thing? I don't agree with Marjorie Taylor Greene on just about anything. I think she's nuts. But I gotta say, I agree with her here. But wait, there's more. Many more articles talking about this topic. From the Brookings Institute, December 13th, 2021. How seriously should we take talk of U.S. state secession? U.S. News and World Report, November 5th, 2021. America, love it or leave it. Long-standing political divisions within states are being heightened in a hyper-partisan climate, fueling secession movements across the country as walking away is looking easier than coming together. Then there is coverage of specific state separatist or secessionist movements. January 14th, 2022, in the New Hampshire Business Review. What would it look like if New Hampshire actually seceded from the U.S.? It's an unlikely occurrence, but a proposed constitutional amendment wants to do just that. And Salon.com. So we talked about Salon earlier. This was November 9th, 2021. Ted Cruz says Texas should secede and take the military if Democrats destroy the country. Calls for secession have become a right-wing trope, but there's no constitutional way to accomplish it peacefully. Well, we've talked about that before. So again, what we're seeing in all of these mainstream media outlets, Washington Post, the Brookings Institute, Salon, U.S. News and World Report, is a serious discussion about secession and the breakup of the United States. Something that was a fringe idea even a year or two ago, now being talked about seriously in major media. Finally, let's talk about civil war and the possibility of violence and political instability in the United States. This is finally getting some mainstream media attention. NPR, December 1st, 2021. Democracy is declining in the U.S., but it's not all bad news, a report finds. So what they're reporting on here is the fact that the United States, for the first time, has been labeled a, quote, backsliding democracy in a new report from the European think tank International IDEA. So, quote, I think for many of those studying U.S. democracy, this should not come as a surprise. The report's lead author, Annika Silver-Leander, said, unquote. So not only are they saying, look, democracy is backsliding, but it shouldn't even be a surprise if you're paying attention. Then there was the opinion piece in, again, the Washington Post a little while back. This was on December 17th by Paul Eaton, Antonio Taguba, and Stephen Anderson. These are three retired generals. The military must prepare now for a 2024 insurrection. So they're saying, look, what happened on January 6th could repeat itself. Quote, as we approach the first anniversary of the deadly insurrection at the U.S. Capitol, we, all of us former senior military officials, are increasingly concerned about the aftermath of the 2024 presidential election and the potential for lethal chaos inside our military, which would put all Americans at severe risk. In short, we are chilled to our bones at the thought of a coup succeeding next time, unquote. And they continue on to talk about a total breakdown in the chain of command along partisan lines in the U.S. military, which is really frightening to consider. Quote, the lack of military preparedness for the aftermath of the 2020 election was striking and worrying. Trump's acting defense secretary, Christopher Miller, testified that he deliberately withheld military protection of the Capitol before January 6. Army General Mark A. Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, reportedly scrambled to ensure the nation's nuclear defense chains were secure from illegal orders. It is evident the whole of our military was caught off guard, unquote. So he's saying, look, maybe you think the United States is unstable, maybe you think there's civil unrest, but we don't need to be too worried because, we can always count on the military. And here's three retired generals saying, no, you can't even count on the military necessarily. There's a risk that the military might fracture. And what are you going to do then? Next, we have Ari Berman. This is January 13th, 2022, in Mother Jones. And this article is entitled The Coming Coup: How Republicans Are Laying the Groundwork to Steal Future Elections. Quote, more than 160 Republican candidates who've amplified the big lie are running for statewide positions with authority over how elections are run. That's akin to giving a robber a key to the bank, says Colorado's Griswold. Many more election deniers are running for local positions like poll worker and election judge. And Republicans are not coy about their intentions. Quote, we are going to take over the election apparatus, unquote. Former Trump chief strategist Steve Bannon, an architect of this strategy, said on his podcast in late December, calling for the, quote, overthrow of county election clerks. If hijacking election administration fails, extreme gerrymandering makes it more likely that Republican legislators in increasingly safe districts, insulated from public accountability, will decide to overturn the will of their state's voters in presidential contests, unquote. And Berman continues, quote, GOP-controlled states have passed new voter suppression laws, gerrymandered maps, and election subversion bills through simple majority party line votes. Yet recalcitrant centrist Democrats, Senators Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, have insisted that any federal legislation stopping such measures requires a bipartisan supermajority, portraying the filibuster not as an impediment to protecting democracy, but as integral to its functioning. It's a situation that evokes the end of the Reconstruction. Back then, insurrectionist Democrats, then the party of white supremacy, used every means necessary, including violence and vote rigging, to retake control of the state and federal governments, while accommodationist Republicans, then the party of civil rights, appealed to bipartisan unity, touted economic legislation, and supported the filibuster to block voting rights legislation, leading to nearly a century of Jim Crow. unquote. But wait, there's more. Barbara F. Walter is an expert on civil unrest and civil war. She worked for the CIA studying the different factors that lead up to civil war and developing models that predict which countries might be likely to see a civil war. And she has a new book out, How Civil Wars Start and How to Stop Them. And she says, quote, "We are closer to civil war than any of us would like to believe." And she talks about two major factors that are the most important predictors of a civil war. One of them is that the country is in kind of the midway point or the halfway point between fully democratic, so a full democracy, and a fully authoritarian regime. So kind of in that no man's land. She calls it anocracy, so midway between democracy and autocracy. And kind of sounds like where the United States is, isn't it? We're a declining democracy. We really haven't been a democracy for quite a while. Maybe we were briefly in the mid-60s, but we all know with the amount of money in politics, the influence that corporations have over politicians, and the anti-democratic nature of institutions like the Senate and the Electoral College and gerrymandering, we know that we really don't live in a democracy to begin with, and it's just getting worse. So we're in this no man's land between democracy and autocracy or authoritarianism. And the second major factor that she says is when a major party in the country begins to represent people not based on ideology, but on ethnic, religious, or racial identity. In other words, there's a kind of racial or ethnic factionalization where one of the major parties represents people based on identity instead of policy or political ideology. And that sounds a lot like the Republican Party right now. The Republican Party is basically a white grievance party at the moment. They've completely given up on policy. They've completely given up on ideology. They have no platform at all. They're just running on white grievance. They're just running on ethnic identity. So sounds like the United States has those two major factors that predict a civil war. And that's exactly what she's saying. And she's gotten a lot of press coverage in major outlets. All the major newspapers, Washington Post, New York Times, NPR, MSNBC, 538. She's been interviewed by a lot of people and really been in the media a lot recently. Then we have George Packer in The Atlantic, December 6, 2021. Are we doomed to head off the next insurrection? We'll need to practice envisioning the worst. Quote, "A year after the insurrection, I'm trying to imagine the death of American democracy." And he continues, "If the end comes, it will come through democracy itself. Here's one way I imagine it can happen. In 2024, disputed election results in several states lead to tangled proceedings in courtrooms and legislatures. The Republican Party's long campaign of undermining faith in elections leaves voters on both sides deeply skeptical of any outcome they don't like. When the next president is finally chosen by the Supreme Court or Congress, half the country explodes in rage. Protests soon turn violent. The crowds are met with lethal force by the state, while instigators firebomb government buildings. Neighborhoods organize self-defense groups, and law enforcement officers take sides or go home. Predominantly red or blue counties turn on political minorities. A family with a Biden-Harris sign has to abandon home on a rural road and flee to the nearest town. A blue militia sacks Trump National Golf Club in Bedminster. A red militia storms Oberlin College. The new president takes power in a state of siege. Unquote. So this is George Packer. So George Packer, if you're not familiar with him, he's a U.S. journalist. He's also a novelist and playwright. He's written in major publications, The Nation, Harper's, New York Times, New Yorker, Mother Jones. And he's really a respected commentator in politics. And he's saying, look, we have to envision the worst. we have to start thinking about what might happen in 2024. Then we have another guest essay, opinion column, the New York Times, January 13, 2022, just a couple days ago. We need to think the unthinkable about our country. This is by Jonathan Stevenson and Stephen Simon. Quote, a year after the January 6th storming of the Capitol, the United States seems perhaps even more alarmingly fractious and divided. Regrettably, the right has sustained its support for Donald Trump and continued its assault on American democratic norms. The next national election will almost inevitably be viciously, perhaps violently, contested. It is fair to say that the right-wing threat to the United States and its apparent goal of laying the groundwork for a power grab, if necessary, in 2024 is politically existential. And he continues on later in the article, quote, a right-wing minority, including many elected politicians, is now practicing a form of brinksmanship by threatening to unilaterally destroy American democracy, daring what it hopes is a timid and somnolent majority to resist. But that majority has the benefit of warning ahead of 2024. So again, not ZMAG, not TruthDig, not the World Socialist website. This is the New York Times, arguably the most important and influential publication on the planet. And they're saying we need to think the unthinkable about the United States. The Boston Globe, January 1st, 2022. Refusal to abide by the results of elections threatens the stability of the U.S. more than at any time since 1860. Quote, the challenge facing the nation in the secession crisis of 1860 to 61 resembles one confronting us today. The failure on both sides of the ideological divide to accept the results of legitimate elections, unquote. CNN, again, no left-wing media outlet, CNN. January 8, 2022, is America heading to civil war or secession? Will the map of America be the same in 50 years? Many fear it's heading towards an armed civil war or secession into two countries. And finally, Vox, January 3rd, 2022. How does this end? Where the crisis in American democracy might be headed? Quote, America's political system is broken, seemingly beyond its normal capacity to repair. Absent some radical development, something we can't yet foresee, these last few unsettling years are less likely to be passed than prologue. Unquote. That's how they finished the article. So again, Vox, super mainstream, super mass media company, talking about is the end of American democracy in sight. So those are a bunch of articles on the instability of the U.S. So we see these four themes. Constitution isn't working. Fascism is rising in the country. Secession, independence, dissolution of the U.S. is a serious topic. And we need to think about civil war and violent political instability in the country. I've just given you close to 30 different sources discussing all of these topics. Many of them, maybe most of them, just in the last 2 or 3 weeks. These are mostly from December and January. And so the point I'm making by throwing all of these sources at you is to say that the California independence movement has been ahead of the curve on a lot of these things. We were talking about these topics. We have been having these discussions and conversations about these issues for a long time, long before they penetrated into the mainstream media. And so maybe you should listen to us now. Again, maybe you should take some of the things that we're saying now seriously and not write it off as alarmist or fringe. People who are ahead of the curve, people who see trends before everyone else sees them, deserve to be listened to. And now that we're seeing these fringe topics finally make it into the mainstream media, I think that it's really a vindication of what a lot of us have been saying for a long time. Okay, next week, I hope to get back into a more common episode where I just pick up a handful of topics, current events, and talk about them. There are a number of current events that I think are important to talk about, and we'll get to those in future episodes. Have a good weekend, and talk to you later.